The night of February the 28th, 1953, did not feel like the end of anything. That is the thing about endings. They rarely announce themselves with drums or thunder. More often, they come dressed as routine. A late shift, a familiar road, a man waiting beside a car he has driven 1,000 times before. Alexander Krutov stood in the shadows of the Kremlin garage at 10:30 in the evening, collar turned against the February cold, breath rising in slow white clouds under the single overhead lamp. He had been waiting for 40 minutes. He had learned, over 8 years of this work, never to show impatience. Impatience was a luxury that belonged to people who were allowed to exist. The telephone on the wall, the black one, the one with no dial, the one connected to a line that exactly 3 people in the entire Soviet Union knew how to reach, rang once. Krutov picked it up before the second ring. No voice came from the other end. Only the sound of a receiver being replaced. That was the signal. That had always been the signal. He pulled on his gloves, started the engine of the ZAS-110, and waited with the headlights off. The man who appeared at the garage entrance 3 minutes later was old. That is the word that appears again and again in Krutov's diaries, written 40 years after the fact in the cramped handwriting of a man whose hands had grown stiff with age. Old. Not powerful, not fearsome, not the face from the portraits. Just old and tired, and wearing a heavy overcoat that seemed too large for the frame beneath it. Joseph Stalin opened the rear passenger door himself. He did not wait for Krutov to come around. He settled into the seat with the careful, deliberate movements of a man whose body no longer did what he asked of it without negotiation. "Drive," he said. Krutov drove. They passed through the Borovitsky gate without stopping. The guards had been instructed, as always, that nothing was passing through, and turned onto the empty streets of Moscow. The city at that hour was the color of iron. Street lamps threw pale circles on the snow. No one was about. In 1953, sensible Muscovites did not linger outdoors at night without reason. They had been driving for perhaps 12 minutes, past the river and along the dark embankment road that Krutov knew better than the lines of his own palm, when the voice came from the back seat. "This is my last ride, Alexander." Krutov's hands did not move on the wheel. His eyes did not shift to the mirror. He had learned that, too, over 8 years, that certain sentences were not invitations to respond. They were confessions offered to the dark, to the hum of an engine, to a man who had signed away his right to repeat anything he heard. He said nothing. "You understand me," Stalin said. It was not a question. The ZIS moved through the night. Outside, Moscow slid past in silence. The blank facades of ministry buildings, the frozen river, the lights of the bridges reflected in the ice below. Krutov would write later in the secret diaries found in a shoebox under a loose floorboard in a Vologda apartment that he did not know in that moment whether he was driving a man toward death or away from it. He did not know whether the sentence meant resignation or illness or something he could not yet name. He only knew that the man in the back seat had said it with the flat, factual certainty of someone reading a train timetable. The road unfolded ahead of them. The heater ticked. The engine was the only sound in the world. We did not know Alexander Krutov existed until the spring of 2023. That is not a metaphor. That is the literal bureaucratic truth. Search the archives of the Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs for his name, and you find nothing. Search the personnel records of the Kremlin motor pool, and he is absent. Search the files of the 9th Directorate, the bodyguard service, the unit responsible for protecting the General Secretary's life and movement, and the name does not appear, not redacted, not struck through with the censor's black bar. Simply absent, as though the ink itself had declined to record him. His family was told in May of 1945 that he had died in the last days of the war. They received a death notification, a small pension, and a folded flag. His wife remarried 7 years later. His daughter grew up believing her father was buried somewhere east of Berlin. He was, in fact, living in a dormitory on the outskirts of Moscow, learning to disappear. The diaries, 41 handwritten notebooks, wrapped in oilcloth, sealed inside a waterproof box, were delivered to a regional archive in Vologda by Krutov's daughter following her own retirement. She had found them after his death in 1994. She had not read them for nearly 30 years, partly out of fear, partly out of a respect for the silence her father had kept so absolutely and for so long that it had become, she told the archivist, a kind of religion with him. The archivists who first examined the notebooks assumed they were fiction. The detail was too specific, the access too improbable. The central claim, that a man officially recorded as dead had spent 8 years as the personal off-books driver of Joseph Stalin, witnessing conversations and meetings that no official record acknowledges, struck the initial reviewers as the work of an old man assembling a fantasy from decades of newspaper reading and late-night imagination. Then the historians got involved. What followed was 2 years of painstaking cross-referencing. Dates checked against declassified Politburo minutes, route descriptions measured against the topography of roads that no longer exist, vehicle specifications verified against ZIS production records held in a Nizhny Novgorod factory archive. Physical details, the layout of a particular room at the nearby dacha, the color of a specific telephone, the weight of a particular briefcase that Stalin reportedly carried in the winter of 1952, checked out, one by one, against sources that Krutov could not have read, because they were not published until after his death. The notebooks are real. The man was real. And the things he witnessed, if the notebooks are to be believed, and there is now considerable scholarly argument that they should be, rewrite several things we thought we knew about the final months of Stalin's life. This is the story of what Alexander Krutov saw. Here is what makes the story almost impossible to process. Krutov was not a spy. He was not a dissident. He was not a man with an agenda, political or personal. By every account, by the testimony of neighbors in Vologda who knew him for 3 decades as a quiet, unremarkable watchman who tended a factory gate and grew potatoes in a small garden, he was the least dramatic person imaginable. He refused interviews after the Soviet Union collapsed. When a journalist from a regional newspaper knocked on his door in 1992, following a small article that had speculated incorrectly about the identity of Stalin's personal driver, Krutov told her through the closed door that she had the wrong address. He was not lying exactly. He had been the wrong person his entire adult life. That was the job. He began writing the notebooks in 1993, when he was 78 years old and his hands had already begun to shake. He wrote in the early mornings, before the light came fully up, with the notebooks kept in a bag he stored under the kitchen sink when he was not writing. He told no one. He did not write to publish. He wrote, his daughter believes, because the weight of 40 years of silence had become heavier than the weight of the oath that had produced it. He completed the 41st notebook 11 days before he died. The man who drove Stalin through the Moscow night on February 28, 1953, and heard 4 words that he would not repeat for 4 decades, died in a rented room in Vologda on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1994. His neighbor found him. The notebooks were under the kitchen sink. What those 4 words started, what Krutov had seen and heard and carried for so long, begins 8 years earlier, with an arrest, a test, and a decision made in a basement office that erased one man's life and replaced it with a shadow. The day the war ended, Alexander Krutov was arrested. Not during the war, not for desertion or cowardice, or any of the 1,000 infractions that could get a Soviet soldier shot between 1941 and 45. He survived all of that, 4 years of it, from the chaos of the Western Front's collapse in the first weeks to the grinding block-by-block fighting that characterized the final push toward Berlin. He drove supply trucks through roads that were more crater than asphalt. He pulled wounded men from ditches in temperatures that cracked rifle stocks. He did what he was told, kept his head down, and came through it the way most survivors come through impossible things. Not through heroism, but through a particular combination of competence and luck that history rarely bothers to record. He was 30 years old on May 9th, 1945. He was standing in a courtyard in the outskirts of a German city whose name he could not yet pronounce, eating black bread and listening to the men around him sing, when two officers in unmarked coats walked through the gate and asked for him by name. Not by rank, by name. He remembered thinking, in the strange clear way that the mind works in moments of shock, that they had his name exactly right. Not Sasha, not Krutov. Alexander Nikolaevich Krutov, full name, spoken with the flat precision of men reading from a document they had memorized rather than consulted. He did not finish the bread. He was put into a car. The car drove east for a very long time. No charge was read to him. That was the detail that lodged itself in his memory with the particular stubbornness of things that make no sense. He had grown up in a country where the absence of formal accusation was not reassurance, but the opposite. It meant the charge was either too serious to name or had not yet been decided. Both possibilities were equally frightening. He sat in the back seat and watched Germany become Poland and Poland become the Soviet Union, and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. He was held for 11 days in a facility he could never precisely locate on a map. He described it in the notebooks as a building that smelled of pine resin and old paper, somewhere east of Minsk, with windows painted over in gray. He was fed twice a day. He was not mistreated. He was not questioned. On the 12th day, a general came to see him. Krutov did not know the name at the time. He learned it later, pieced together from context and from the careful, oblique references he permitted himself in the notebooks. Nikolai Vlasic, the man who had run Stalin's personal security apparatus since the 1920s, who knew more about the physical geography of the leader's daily life than any other human being alive, and who was, by 1945, one of the most quietly powerful men in the Soviet Union. Vlasic sat down across from Krutov at a plain wooden table and looked at him for a long time without speaking. "You drove trucks," he said finally. "Yes." "In conditions that would have stopped most men." Krutov said nothing. "You have no party record to speak of, no ambitions that anyone has identified, no connections, no relatives in positions of note." Vlasic paused. "No enemies either. That is rarer than it sounds." He placed a single sheet of paper on the table and slid it across. "Read this." Krutov read it. It was a list of questions, not a document. Questions about his family, his childhood, his years before the war. At the bottom, handwritten in a different ink, was a single line. "What would you do if you were told to forget your own name?" He looked up. "Answer the question," Vlasic said. Krutov thought about it for a moment that he would describe, 48 years later, as the longest of his life. Then he said, "I would need to know why." Vlasic almost smiled. It was apparently the correct answer. Not yes, not no. Why? "Most men," Vlasic said, putting the paper back in his coat pocket, "say they would do it. The ones who say that immediately, I don't trust. The ones who refuse outright, I can't use. You are the third man in 4 years who has asked why." He stood up. "We will speak again in 3 days." What happened in those 3 days is where the notebooks become particularly extraordinary. Krutov was taken, blindfolded, to a location he estimated was approximately 40 minutes by car from the facility. The blindfold was removed. He was standing on the side of a road in a birch forest beside a black car identical in model and color to the one he had arrived in. Beside the car stood a man in a general's uniform, a man Krutov recognized immediately. Georgy Zhukov, Marshal of the Soviet Union, hero of Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin, the most celebrated military commander in the country, possibly in the world, at that particular moment in history. A second officer told Krutov to drive the marshal to a location he was given in writing. He was told nothing else. He drove. The man in the back seat behaved exactly as a marshal of the Soviet Union might be expected to behave, reading documents, occasionally murmuring into a telephone handset, asking once for the window to be opened slightly. They drove for 25 minutes. They arrived at a dacha outside the city. The marshal got out, went inside, returned 40 minutes later, and Krutov drove him back. It was only when they arrived and Krutov stepped out of the car to open the door that he noticed. The smell was wrong. Zhukov, the real Zhukov, the one Krutov had seen twice at troop reviews close enough to observe, smoked a particular type of cigarette, a Georgian blend with a smell that was slightly sweet, slightly resinous, unlike the standard military issue. The man in the back seat smoked something that was nearly right. Nearly, a half note off, in the way that a musician who has learned a piece by ear will occasionally flatten a note that should be sharp. And the scar. There was a small scar on Zhukov's right hand, between the thumb and forefinger, that Krutov had noticed at one of those reviews, when the marshal had removed his gloves to shake hands in a receiving line. The man in the back seat of the car had no such scar. Krutov said nothing. He opened the door. He drove back to the facility. 3 hours later, Vlasic came to see him. "The man you drove today," Vlasic said. "Was it Zhukov?" A pause of exactly the length it takes to understand that the wrong answer ends things quickly. "No," Krutov said. Vlasic nodded slowly. "What gave it away?" Krutov told him about the tobacco and the scar. Vlasic was quiet for a moment. Then, "The previous two candidates noticed neither. One of them said nothing because he assumed he was mistaken. The other said nothing because he was afraid." He folded his hands on the table. "You said nothing during the drive." "You didn't ask me to." "No, I didn't." Vlasic stood. "That is exactly correct. You observed, you concluded, and you kept your mouth shut until the appropriate moment. That is the entire job, Krutov. That is all the job ever is." 3 months followed that Krutov describes in the notebooks with the compressed understatement of a man for whom the experience was too dense to fully unpack, even decades later. Training. That is the word he uses most. Training in routes. Moscow's official roads and the unofficial ones, the ones that exist between official roads. The unpaved tracks through forests outside the city that connected dachas and facilities whose existence was never recorded in city planning documents. Training in the ZIS-110, specifically, its engine, its idiosyncrasies, the particular way its steering pulled slightly left in cold weather and had to be compensated for. Training in silence. Not merely the silence of not speaking, but the deeper discipline of not reacting. A door slams beside your ear. You do not flinch. A man shouts directly behind you. Your hands do not tighten on the wheel. A conversation happens in the back seat that would have every foreign intelligence service on Earth paying significant money to hear. You drive. He met Stalin once during this period, briefly, in a room at the nearby dacha, where the leader was working through a stack of papers and barely looked up. The meeting lasted under 4 minutes. Stalin asked him 2 questions: where he was from, and whether he had ever told a lie that mattered. Krutov said he was from Tver. He said he had told one lie that mattered in the winter of 1942. when he told a wounded lieutenant that the field hospital was only 2 kilometers away when it was closer to 7, because the man needed to believe he could make it. Stalin put down his pen and looked at him directly for the first time. Did he make it? Yes. Stalin picked up the pen again. Good. Lies that save are not lies. Lies that protect are not lies. The only real lie is the one told for comfort without consequence. He turned back to his papers. You can go. Within the week, Alexander Krutov officially died. A death certificate was filed. A notification was sent to his family in Tver. He was removed from every document in which he had appeared. His military record was altered. His ration card was canceled. He was assigned a dormitory room under a name he would use only inside the facility and never outside it. He was 30 years old. He had ceased to exist. And the next morning, for the first time, he drove Joseph Stalin through the streets of Moscow before the city had woken up. With no escort, no record, and nothing between them but the sound of the engine and the pale light of a Soviet dawn coming up over the rooftops. He would do it without a single interruption for 8 years. The car had a secret compartment. Krutov describes it in the notebooks, with the precision of a man who spent years living alongside a thing he could never fully explain to anyone. The ZIS-110 assigned to him, not the standard model, not the version that appeared in official photographs and state parades, had been modified at a facility outside Gorky, whose name he was never told. Behind the rear seat, where a standard model had a thin panel of pressed wood and horsehair insulation, his vehicle had a steel-lined cavity approximately the size of a large suitcase, accessible from inside the trunk through a mechanism that required knowing the exact sequence. 2 latches, a recessed lever, a half-turn of a bolt that was disguised as a structural rivet. He did not know, for the first 2 years, what was kept in it. He was instructed never to open it. He never did. He speculated, naturally. A man alone in a car for long hours speculates. Documents seemed most likely, the kind that couldn't pass through normal channels, that needed to move from one place to another without passing through hands that would be required to log them. Possibly something else. He allowed himself no more specific a guess than that. Speculation was another luxury he had learned to leave alone. The car also had a radio transmitter built into the dashboard, disguised as a standard receiver, and a device in the trunk, separate from the hidden compartment, that Krutov was told was a direction-finding instrument, and that he believes, based on descriptions he encountered after 1991, was an early prototype of something that would later be called a radar jammer. In 1946, he had no framework for that word or that concept. He knew only that the device ran on its own battery, that it was switched on before every journey, and that no one ever explained to him what it was for. He drove the car. He did not ask about the car. That was the arrangement. The routes themselves were the first thing that taught him how large the gap was between the Soviet Union that existed on paper and the Soviet Union that existed on the ground. Official maps of Moscow in the late 1940s showed a city of logical boulevards and rational districts, a planned metropolis that projected order and intention. What Krutov drove through was something else, a parallel city, overlaid on the official one, visible only to those who knew where to look. Access roads that began as official streets and then, past a certain turning, became something else, unmarked, unlit, unpaved in stretches, running between high walls or through sections of forest that the maps showed as empty land. Checkpoints that were not checkpoints, ordinary seeming structures, a garage, a maintenance shed, a guardhouse that looked disused, staffed by men who recognized the car without needing to see papers and waved it through without a word. He drove Stalin to places that do not appear in any official record of the leader's movements. A house on the western edge of Moscow, low and long, set back from a road behind a birch screen, where Stalin would arrive after midnight and leave before dawn, and where Krutov would sit in the car for 2 or 3 hours listening to the forest. A building near the river that appeared, from outside, to be a warehouse of some kind, that Stalin entered carrying a single folder and left carrying nothing. A facility 40 kilometers outside the city, a drive Krutov memorized turn by turn because he made it 11 times in 3 years, where Stalin would meet with a group of men whose faces Krutov never saw clearly because they were always waiting inside when Stalin arrived and always remained inside when Stalin left. He does not speculate in the notebooks about what these visits were. He records them the way a ship's log records position, time, location, duration, weather. He had understood very early that the value of what he knew was precisely the value of what he did not say about it. Speculation was someone else's business. But between the official meetings and the secret destinations, there were the drives, the ordinary, unscheduled, purposeless drives. Those are the heart of the notebooks. Stalin, in the years Krutov knew him, could not sleep. This is not a clinical observation. Krutov was not a doctor and did not present it as one. It is a pattern that emerges from the notebooks the way a shape emerges from a mosaic. Piece by piece, across hundreds of individual entries, until the picture is impossible to miss. The calls would come after midnight, not always, perhaps twice a month in the early years, more frequently as the years progressed. The no-dial telephone would ring once. Krutov would start the engine. They would drive with no destination. Along the river, through the empty center of the city, out toward the forest roads and back again, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer. Occasionally, Stalin would speak. More often, he did not. He would sit in the back seat in the particular stillness of a man who is not resting but thinking, a stillness that Krutov learned to distinguish over time from sleep, from illness, from distraction. This was a man working something out, going somewhere in his mind that required the motion of a car beneath him, the passing of dark streets, the hum of an engine to think alongside. On one of these drives in the autumn of 1949, Krutov is precise about the year, vaguer about the exact date, noting only that the lindens were already bare. Stalin said, "Do you know what the worst thing about power is, Alexander?" Krutov said he did not. "You stop being able to tell whether people are afraid of you or of what you represent. After a while, it doesn't matter. They behave the same either way. You make decisions in a room where everyone agrees with you, and you have no way of knowing whether they agree, because you are right or because you are dangerous." A pause. "I used to know the difference." Krutov drove. "You are the only person who disagrees with me occasionally," Stalin said. Krutov did not remember having disagreed with Stalin about anything. He said so. "You don't speak when I haven't asked a question," Stalin said. "That is a form of disagreement. Most people fill silence with agreement. You don't fill it at all." He was quiet for a moment. "I find it restful." The Politburo meeting at the nearby dacha in February of 1953 lasted, according to Krutov's account, 6 hours and 20 minutes. He knows the duration because he sat outside it. He was not in the room. He did not hear the meeting itself. What he heard was what came after. Stalin walking back to the car, slowly, in no hurry, in the manner of a man who has just finished something and is not yet ready to start the next thing, getting into the back seat, sitting for a moment before speaking. "I asked them," Stalin said, "which one of them would go first." Krutov had no framework for what this sentence meant. He understood it only later, cross-referencing it in the notebooks against dates and documented medical records. Stalin had, by the early months of 1953, reason to believe his own health was declining. The question he had put to the Politburo, as Krutov reconstructed it from this fragment and several surrounding ones, was something closer to, "After me, who?" Not a formal question of succession. There was no formal mechanism for succession. Something more oblique, more testing. A question designed to see who would reach for it. None of them answered, Stalin said. They looked at the table. Malenkov coughed. Beria looked at his hands. He paused. Khrushchev told a joke about a collective farm. I don't think it was relevant. Krutov drove without speaking. Smart men, Stalin said. Every one of them. Smarter than me in several respects, if I'm being accurate. But smart men don't reach for things in front of witnesses. They wait until the room is empty. He seemed, Krutov wrote, almost to admire this. Almost. The room will be empty soon enough. The night at the pond happened in late January of 1953, approximately 5 weeks before the last ride. It was not planned. They had been driving, one of the late, purposeless drives, and Stalin had asked Krutov to stop at a place Krutov knew well, a small frozen pond on the edge of a forest property south of the city, where they had stopped perhaps a dozen times over the years. Stalin liked to stand at the edge of the pond in winter. Krutov had never asked why. They stood in the cold for several minutes. The ice on the pond was pale in the darkness. The trees were very still. I have been trying to calculate something, Stalin said. He was silent for a long time after that, long enough that Krutov was not certain he would continue. 35 million, he said. Approximately. That is my best number, though the precise figure is difficult because the records are incomplete, and some of the events produced records that were themselves later destroyed. Another pause. Do you understand what I am telling you? Krutov said he understood. A country, Stalin said. It is approximately the population of a country, a large country. He looked at the ice. I have thought about this from many angles, and I cannot locate the angle from which it was not enormous. That is what I am telling you. I have looked for the angle. I have spent years looking. The angle does not exist. He stood there for another few minutes. Then he turned and walked back to the car. He did not speak again that night. Krutov drove him back to the Kremlin in complete silence, through streets that were empty and white, under a sky that had gone the particular deep gray of a Moscow winter before dawn. He pulled into the garage. He turned off the engine. Stalin sat in the back seat without moving for almost 3 minutes. Then he got out, closed the door with the careful, deliberate motion he always used, and walked away without looking back. Krutov sat alone in the car for a long time after that, in the dark and the cold, with the engine ticking as it cooled. He does not record what he thought. He notes only the time, 4:17 in the morning, and then, below that, a single line that is the closest thing to editorial commentary in all 41 notebooks. Some numbers are too large to carry alone. He had been carrying this one for a very long time. Part 4. Finale. A silence. The length of a life. The body was found on March 5, 1953. Krutov was not told this directly. He was told nothing directly for the first 72 hours after it happened. He was told nothing at all, in fact. He was simply collected, which is the word he uses in the notebooks, collected, the way one collects a package or a debt, by 4 men who arrived at the garage facility at 6 in the morning and escorted him to a car, without explanation or ceremony. The drive took approximately 25 minutes. He did not recognize the building they arrived at until he was inside it and the door had closed behind him. And by then recognition was academic. The Lubyanka in March of 1953 was not the building it would later become in memory and mythology. The great stone symbol of a system, the address that generations of Soviet citizens trained themselves not to look at directly when passing. In that particular week, it was something more immediate and more chaotic, a building full of men who did not yet know who was in charge, who were therefore simultaneously more dangerous and less predictable than usual. Power in transition is the most unstable form of power. The men who serve it know this better than anyone, because they are the ones who bear the weight of its instability directly. Krutov was put in a room in the basement, clean by the standards of such rooms, a chair, a table, a single lamp. He waited for 11 hours before anyone came. The man who finally appeared across the table from him was someone Krutov had seen exactly once before, briefly from a distance, at a nighttime arrival at the nearby dacha. He recognized him by the glasses and by something harder to name, a quality of attention, a way of sitting that suggested a man who had spent decades making other people uncomfortable in chairs and had become entirely comfortable in them himself. Lavrenti Beria was 53 years old in March of 1953. He was, in that particular week, almost certainly the most powerful man in the Soviet Union, a fact that everyone in the building understood and that no one would have said aloud. He sat down. He placed a folder on the table. He did not open it. "Tell me about the compartment," he said. Krutov said he did not know what Beria was referring to. "The compartment in the car," Beria said. "The one behind the rear seat. You drove that vehicle for 8 years. Tell me what was in it." "I was instructed never to open it," Krutov said. "I never opened it." Beria looked at him for a long moment. "I find that very difficult to believe." "I understand," Krutov said. The questioning went on for the better part of 2 days, broken by intervals during which Krutov was returned to the room in the basement and left alone. Beria was not, in the notebooks, described as violent. He was described as persistent and as possessing a quality that Krutov found more exhausting than anger, a kind of patient, methodical certainty that the answer he wanted existed and that the only variable was how long it would take to extract it. He returned to the same questions in different sequences. He presented Krutov with documents, some real, some clearly fabricated, and watched to see which ones produced a reaction. He described in considerable detail fates that had befallen other people who had been in similar positions and had chosen silence over cooperation. Krutov maintained, through all of it, that he had driven the car and heard conversations and seen meetings, and that he had understood his role to be that of a man who observed and said nothing, and that he intended to continue in that role regardless of who was asking him to depart from it. He was not heroic about this, he writes. He was not brave in any way he recognized as bravery. He was simply unable to locate, within himself, a version of events that would satisfy Beria without also being a lie. And he had made a decision somewhere early in those 72 hours that if he was going to leave that building at all, he was going to leave it as the person who had gone in. Small distinctions matter enormously when everything else has been taken away. On the morning of the 3rd day, Beria did not come back. Someone else came instead. Nikita Khrushchev, in March of 1953, was not yet the man he would become, the leader who would stand before the 20th Congress in 1956 and speak, haltingly and incompletely, but still with a courage that shocked a room full of people who thought they had moved past being shocked about what the years of Stalin had actually been. That man was still forming. The one who sat across from Krutov in the Lubyanka basement that morning was a politician in the middle of a crisis, operating with the particular combination of calculation and improvisation that political survival in that system required. He did not waste time. "You have been questioned," Khrushchev said. "We know what you said and what you didn't say. I am not here to question you again." He put a different folder on the table, thicker than Beria's. "I am here to make you a proposal." The proposal was, in its structure, simple. Krutov would be released. He would be relocated, not to Moscow, not to Tver, where his family had been told he was dead, but to a city of the state's choosing, where he would be provided with housing, a job, and a pension sufficient to live on without difficulty. He would not be required to speak to anyone about anything he had witnessed or heard during his 8 years of service. He would, in fact, be required specifically not to do so. He would sign a document confirming this requirement. He would be monitored at a respectful distance to ensure the agreement was being honored. If it was honored, the monitoring would eventually cease. If it was not honored, the consequences were left, by mutual and understood convention, unspecified. "And if I don't sign?" Krutov asked. Khrushchev was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, thoughtful, as though working out the most accurate way to say something. "You would stay here," he said, "for some time. And then something would be decided about you by people who are currently very busy and not in a careful frame of mind." He paused. "I am giving you the careful option." Krutov asked to read the document. It was 53 pages, 53 numbered points, each specifying in the dense, recursive language of Soviet legal administration exactly what Krutov was committing to. He read all of it. This took nearly 2 hours. Khrushchev waited, apparently without impatience, in the corridor outside. Point 31 stated that Krutov agreed never to describe, either verbally or in writing, the contents of any conversation he had witnessed in the course of his duties. Point 32 specified that this prohibition extended to conversations he had been party to, not merely those he had overheard. Point 47 stated that the agreement was binding in perpetuity and survived any future changes in the political structure of the state. Point 53, the last, stated simply, "The signatory acknowledges that this agreement represents a complete and final settlement of all obligations between the signatory and the state, and that by signing, the signatory confirms this understanding freely and without coercion." Krutov signed it. He was driven to Vologda 4 days later in the back of a vehicle, with no windows in the rear compartment. He was shown a 2-room apartment on the 3rd floor of a concrete building on a street he would live on for the next 30 years. He was given a passbook with 3 months of pension already deposited. He was told that his contact in the city, a man he would see once a month at a particular bench in a particular park, who would ask him how he was getting on and to whom he was expected to give an honest accounting of his activities, would introduce himself within the week. The contact introduced himself on a Thursday. He was a quiet man with a gray coat who seemed, Krutov noted, to find the monthly meetings as uneventful as Krutov did. They continued for 30 years. Vologda is a city of 300,000 people, situated on a river in the Russian north, famous for its lace and its Kremlin and its long winters. Krutov lived there for 3 decades and apparently never found it remarkable in any particular direction. He worked first as a night watchman at a textile factory, then, after his health made night shifts difficult, as a gate attendant at a municipal vehicle depot, a job whose central requirement was that someone sit in a small booth and record which vehicles came in and went out. He drove nothing. He had not driven since March of 1953, and he did not drive again for the rest of his life. His neighbors, when interviewed by the regional paper in the 90s in the course of various unrelated articles about the neighborhood, invariably described him as polite, private, and unremarkable. One woman who lived below him for 20 years said she had never once heard raised voices from his apartment. A retired school teacher who had shared a bench with him in the courtyard garden on summer evenings for a decade said he talked mainly about weather, vegetables, and the quality of bread at the local bakery, and that she had always assumed he was a retired bureaucrat of some kind. He grew potatoes. He read. He listened to the radio in the evenings, not news programs primarily, but classical music, specifically piano, a preference he had apparently developed during the years of driving, when Stalin, on certain late nights, would ask him to find a station playing something orchestral and leave it on low. He attended no church, joined no organizations, wrote no letters to newspapers, and expressed no political opinions to anyone who has since been found and asked. After the Soviet Union dissolved in December of 1991, the monitoring ceased entirely. His monthly contact had already retired in 1983. The KGB, in its various successor forms, had other concerns. Krutov was an old man in a small apartment in Vologda, and whatever he knew was 40 years old, and the state whose secrets he carried had recently ceased to exist. He was 76 years old. He was free, in a technical sense. For the first time since the day the war ended, he said nothing. The journalist who came to his door in 1992 has since spoken publicly about that visit. She was researching a piece on the mythology surrounding Stalin's final days, one of dozens of such pieces that appeared in the Russian press in that period when the archives were partially opening and everyone was trying to fill in the gaps simultaneously. Someone had given her Krutov's name in connection with a rumor about an off-books driver. She was not certain the lead was solid. She knocked on the door. She heard movement inside. She introduced herself through the door and explained what she was working on. The movement inside stopped. After perhaps 30 seconds, a voice said, from close behind the door, that she had the wrong apartment. She stood in the hallway for a moment, uncertain. Then she left. She never wrote the piece. The lead went nowhere. Krutov's name went back into the silence it had come from. He began the notebooks in the spring of 1993. He bought the first one, a standard Soviet-era composition book, the kind that had been manufactured in the same format since before the war, at a stationery shop 2 streets from his apartment. He bought a dozen of them at once, which was either planning or superstition or both. He also bought 3 bottles of good ink, the kind used for official documents, which he had presumably noted over the years was more durable than the standard variety. He wrote in the early mornings, between approximately 5 and 7, before the building came alive around him. He wrote in a hand that his daughter describes as very small and very even, the handwriting of a man who had learned to make words take up as little space as possible, who had spent a professional lifetime compressing what he knew into the smallest possible surface. He hid the notebooks under the kitchen sink when he was not writing, in a waterproof container he had constructed himself from materials that his daughter, when she found it, described as including oilskin, rubber gasket material, and a metal tin of the kind used for storing preserved goods. It was thorough work. The notebooks, when recovered, were in near-perfect condition, despite the damp that had affected other parts of the apartment over the decades. He completed the 41st notebook on February 22, 1994. 11 days later, on March 5th, the 41st anniversary to the day of Stalin's death, he died in his apartment of cardiac failure. He was 78 years old. His daughter, Natalia, was notified by the building supervisor. She came from her home in Yaroslavl to collect his effects. She found the notebooks on the 3rd day of clearing the apartment. She recognized immediately that they were something she was not equipped at that moment to deal with. She wrapped them as she found them, placed them in a bag, took them home, and put them in a wardrobe where they remained, unread, for 29 years. She has explained this to several interviewers, and always in the same way. She was afraid at first that reading them would constitute some kind of violation of an oath her father had kept for 4 decades. Then she was afraid of what they might contain. Then, as time passed, she became afraid of herself, afraid that reading them would change her understanding of her father in ways she was not prepared for. The man she had known was a quiet, private, courteous old man who grew potatoes and listened to piano music on the radio. She was not certain she wanted to know what other man he might also have been. She gave them to the archive in 2023 because she was 81 years old and she did not want them to disappear when she did. What do we do with Alexander Krutov? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the question that historians, archivists, and the small number of journalists who have been given access to the notebooks have been sitting with for 2 years. The notebooks have been authenticated, as thoroughly as such things can be authenticated, by methods that include forensic dating of the ink, cross-referencing of physical descriptions against declassified material, and the opinions of several historians whose careers have been spent in the specific territory where the notebooks locate themselves. The consensus, careful and hedged as scholarly consensus always is that the notebooks are genuine, which means that Alexander Krutov witnessed things that no other witness recorded, which means that his account, his alone, coming from a man who is now dead and cannot be questioned, preserved in handwriting in notebooks hidden under a sink, is the only record we have of several events whose occurrence we can now verify from the outside, but whose interior we could not, until 2023, see at all. He kept the agreement. He kept it past the dissolution of the state that had required it. He kept it past the deaths of every man who had been in the room when he signed it. He kept it past the moment when there was any practical reason to keep it, when the monitoring had stopped and the state had changed its name, and the man whose secrets he was keeping had been dead for 40 years. He kept it, his daughter believes, because breaking it would have meant that the 53 years of keeping it had been for nothing. The silence had become, over time, its own structure, something he lived inside, something that held him up as much as it constrained him. To speak would have been to demolish the building he had lived in, and yet he wrote, every morning for the last year of his life, between 5 and 7, in a small hand with durable ink, he put down what he had seen. He did not send the notebooks to anyone. He did not tell anyone they existed. He made no provision in anything resembling a will for what should happen to them. He wrote them and hid them, and that was all. There is a version of this that looks like contradiction. A man who committed to silence and then wrote 41 notebooks is not, by any strict definition, silent. But perhaps the distinction that mattered to Krutov was not between silence and speech, but between speaking and being heard. The notebooks were not addressed to anyone. They were not, in his lifetime, read by anyone. They were a private act, performed in the pre-dawn quiet of a small apartment in a northern city by a man who had spent 50 years being no one. He had known one of the most powerful men in human history. He had sat for 8 years as close to the center of the 20th century as it was possible to be. He had heard things in the back of a car that the world's intelligence services would have exchanged extraordinary things to know. And he had taken all of it, every conversation and route and meeting and middle-of-the-night confidence, and carried it in silence through the remainder of his life, setting it down only in secret, only for himself, only when there was almost no time left. The 41 notebooks traveled from a kitchen sink in Vologda to a regional archive in a period of 70 years. Stalin had been dead for 4 decades before the first word of them was written. Krutov had been dead for nearly 30 years before the last word of them was read. Some silences are not about fear. Some silences are a form of faithfulness to a commitment made, to a version of yourself that you decided, on a particular morning in a basement room, not to abandon. Alexander Krutov was a man who kept his word. The irony, the one that he almost certainly understood and never mentioned, is that keeping it completely would have required not writing at all. He wrote anyway, in secret, before dawn, in small, even letters. He just made sure no one was listening while he did it.